ברוכות הבאות וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט דמוקרטים מבית המכון לחירות ואחריות באוניברסיטת רייכמן. אני דוקטור חיים, וייצמן, מנהל הדסק הפוליטי במכון, ואנחנו נמצאים באולפני כל האוניברסיטה, מרכז האודיו של אוניברסיטת רייכמן. האורח שלנו הפעם הוא פרופסור גולדסטין, או כמו שהאמריקאים אומרים, גולדסטין. כפי שאתם כבר מבינים, האורח שלנו היום הוא אמריקאי, ולכבודו ננהל את הפרק הזה באנגלית. Professor Ken Goldstein, served as the Senior Vice President for Survey Research and Institutional Policy at the Association of American Universities. Thank you, Professor Goldstein, for being our guest today. The U.S. is exceptional in public support for Israel, and yet we see overall declining trends in this support. How alarming are these trends? Are they representing overall parallel decline among various groups or a decline among specific demographic or political groups, specifically among younger generations? How can we explain this decline?
אז א', תודה על ההזמנה. פעם הבאה אני מבטיח שאני אעשה את הרעיון בעברית. But from now on, we'll do the rest in English, as you said.
Thank you.
It's good to be here and good to be at Rייכמן University and good to be in this building where I've spent some time over the years. You asked a big, complicated question, and I'm a big two things can be true sort of person, or many things can be true sort of person. So, U.S. support for Israel is probably Israel's most valuable strategic asset. When you look at U.S. public opinion, and we can talk about different polls, and I can be a nerd. Was that chnun בעברית, right? I can be a chnun and tell you some problems I have with some of those polls. But it's pretty clear before October 7th and after October 7th, there is general and widespread support for Israel. Specific support for the actions in the war have probably come down a little bit over the last couple of months, but there are differences in age groups. But it's really only a difference in the very youngest age group, which is clearly less supportive of Israel overall, and less supportive of Israel's particular military actions in Gaza. That said, polling young people is technically very difficult, and we do see variance among different polls, and we also, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, see variance in the answers within one poll that got a lot of attention in Israel, because you guys seem to love bad news when it comes to polling.
Yeah, we are Jewish. What does history teach us? These young people, when they grow older, they become more supportive of Israel, or we see the previous young people support less Israel today?
So the great thing about being a historian rather than a political scientist is the historian gets to say what happened,
which we both are not.
Which we are both not. So, but let's play historian for a second. So the question you asked is a great question. Is this a period effect, right? That young people at this particular time. Or is it a generational effect where as they get older, they're going to retain those attitudes? So is this the first time we've been talking about how there's issues on U.S. campuses? And is this the first time we've been talking about how young people are less supportive of Israel? Absolutely not. Talking about it for, well, at least my forever, as long as I can remember. So we know, because we can see the data for older people, so those people who are 55 and older now, 65 and older now, they were once 18 to 24. But I do think it is not automatically attitudes are not automatically going to change as people age. They may. They also may not. There's a couple reasons that one might think that there will not be as great a change as people age. There certainly will be some sort of change. But the composition of younger voters, if you look at the demographics of the United States, people who are over 65 now, the population is over 85% white people. When you're looking at the population who are younger groups, they are much less religious, and they are much more racially and ethnically diverse, and with some caveats, Israel support tends to be more from people who are more religious. And although Israel has received great support from some segments of the black electorate, of black people in the United States, among young people, there is some evidence that support might be significantly less and could endure.
What are the causes of this decline? Is it reflecting eternal shifts in America, or does Israel have anything it can do about this?
So again, I'm going to go back to my standard two things.
We are talking about our hasbara.
Your hasbara. Yeah, and so and of course we've been talking about, Israel's been talking about hasbara forever, I'm sure if we went back thousands of years, they were sitting around on Shabbat dinners saying that we need better hasbara, because again, in my memory, that's always been the case, that Israel has complained about both how they are portrayed overseas and also have complained about those people who are speaking for them, how they're presenting the country. So listen, one part of being a social scientist is we don't believe in single cause explanations. Has there been a rise in anti-Semitism among some segments of the American public? Yes. Has support for Israel been wrapped up in other sorts of politics or ideology in the United States, where it's colonialist versus not colonialist, oppressed versus oppressor? Yes. So, is there some anti-Semitism? Yes. Has Israel been wrapped up that Israel is a powerful white institution, nation, and people are gonna Israel's the lion, and its enemies are the lamb? And part of it is that the current government of Israel, both in its composition and how it speaks to people outside the country, are not speaking in a language that young Americans, for the most part, are going to agree with. And even young Jewish Americans, right? So what we've seen in the United States, and listen, when October 7th happened in the United States, we were shook. You were obviously shook to your core more here. Being in Israel now, it's obviously the only thing one talks about with friends, and you hear even more. You hear even more stories, but and you have incredible unity in the U.S. Jewish community, and you have incredible support in the U.S. Jewish community, but the Jewish community is not in the place where the current Israeli government is in terms of many of its policies.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, prior to October 7th, how much does the proposed constitutional reform, or regime coup, as some people here call it, affect public support for Israel? Would less democratic Israel enjoy less support in America?
So a less democratic Israel would enjoy less support in Israel. I, as the American visitor, am not going to comment about whether those reforms would make you less democratic or, well, probably not going to make you more democratic.
Take my word for it.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. I think that's what you were living here every day. And again, I was here before October 7th. I was here over the summer. And the same way, that's what everyone talked about at dinner. And then everyone went out to the demonstration. So you can
Saturday night Kaplan.
So you can tell what my social circle was. Dinner at a fancy Tel Aviv restaurant and grab a flag, right? But that's what people were doing. That was not on the radar screen for the most part of most Americans, for sure, and of most American Jews. Again, whether fair or not fair. People want there to be peace. People want this problem to be solved. And you can say, well, a little complicated to solve it, right? We've been trying, but I think the perception was that there was less effort, and people were just frustrated that it was going on. And then who do you blame? You blame the person who you perceive is powerful. I mean, what you also saw in surveys of American Jews. A very large disconnect between support for Israel, support for Israelis, and support for the Israeli government, and the support for the prime minister. There was certainly a sizable chunk of Americans who were favorable towards President or Prime Minister Netanyahu, and favorable towards Israel, the Israeli government. There was also a sizable chunk of people, mostly on the younger edge, who were favorable towards Israel, favorable towards Israelis, but were less favorable towards the current government and the current prime minister.
Does it have to do with Netanyahu's intervening in American politics play? Like his speech to Congress against President Obama's wish, or the fact that Ron Dermer was the keynote speaker in Republican political campaign event while being the Israeli ambassador to the United States.
So your radio audience and podcast audience can't see me smiling nervously here, and you smiling mischievously on the other side. So I think that did have a profound impact among a certain sector of Democrats. So the mass public forgot that and didn't care about, doesn't care about, and most Democrats have forgotten about it. But when you look at young Democratic staffers and the people who work on campaigns and the people who work in Congress, I don't want to exaggerate. Israel has overwhelming support in Congress from members of Congress. I think you still see a little bit of bitterness directed at the Netanyahu government and the former Israeli ambassador from that speech in particular.
Yet President Biden, up until now, failed to pass the $14 billion aid to Israel. Yeah. 2 weeks ago. So we could have a debate about which government is functioning between Israel and the United States, but that was not about Israel. There was a aid package which was aid for Israel and aid for Ukraine, which was also tied into another issue about border security that Republicans have wanted. So I think that has very little, if nothing, to do with folks in Congress' support for Israel. That ran into the buzzsaw of a Congress where not much is getting done lately. So you need a little bit of muzzle from time to time.
Exactly.
Okay. To what extent does change in public opinion affect policy? Does it matter?
Sure. So there's not a one-to-one. So leaders and elected leaders don't simply take a poll and decide to do whichever policy is 50 plus one, and whatever a policy is can weather short-term disconnects between public opinion and policy. But in the long run, policy is going to end up syncing with public opinion.
How about media coverage of Israel? How balanced is it? Are different media outlets differing in covering Israel? If so, to what extent?
So I don't know if this is a good thing that I'm admitting here. So I work for ABC News, and I always say they pay me enough to work for them. They don't pay me enough to watch. And so I actually I read a lot. I actually I watch very little of the cable television, of CNN, of Fox, of MSNBC, of the nightly news broadcasts. There's great variance in the coverage, and I also think you see a difference in the politics of newsrooms. There's an article by watch me do a great job of not answering your question. There's a great article by a guy named James Bennett, who worked for the New York Times for a long time, and he's making a strong argument, not a scholarly argument like we would make, but he has a point of view, but he's making a particular argument about what the nature of coverage is, even in a paper like the New York Times.
There is something that I think here in Israel, policymakers do not understand. The way young people in the world, and especially in the United States, get their information, their source of information. They talk about TV, and the young generation are not there.
So that is a great point. And listen, you have a prime minister who became famous going on American late night television, right?
Yeah.
That's where he made his name, going on Nightline. And listen, we're all sort of old guys, and I certainly don't consume information like my students do or young people do, and like the students here do, right? I mean, you walk through campus or everywhere, people are bumping into you because they're looking at their phones, consuming media, and I do think that and there certainly are social media efforts going on, but I think sometimes those social media efforts are old-time media strategies laid upon a new medium, instead of understanding what the new medium is. And that's probably very difficult for a prime minister whose great asset is he speaks fluent, unaccented English. And listen, I remember when I was a kid, right? You'd watch TV, and Bibi Netanyahu would be there speaking in fluent, unaccented English, and then you'd have someone else screaming. And it was a very effective messenger for Israel. It is a vastly different media environment. It's also a vastly different media environment for those young people. Also, let's talk about those young people for a second, about how you communicate with them. And it's the young people, and even more the young people here, right? So think of someone who is, 22, 23, 24 here, and they may be out in Miloim now. They had COVID, right? Their high school might have been interrupted. Their university might have been interrupted. We know both
university is now interrupted.
University is now interrupted. October 7th, war. So, in the United States didn't have the war, but I also think a group of people are having trouble being together. It's probably part of the problem that we're having on college campuses of being together, debating, reaching across, because in some formative years of socialization and of communication, they were sitting alone in their room on school, on Zoom, and their only social connection was the phone with their friends. And I'm sure you're seeing it here even before the war. There was severe mental health issues among young people in the United States.
Yeah, let alone that the fact that the phone is individual.
Exactly.
That TV is social, is for the entire family at least.
Right.
So, yeah.
And again, I'm not a big, because I'm old, I'm not a big social media
but
person.
We're supposed to be the startup nation.
Startup nation.
Yeah.
But it's also the algorithm feeds the addiction.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's you got COVID, and then you add COVID, social media, and then COVID, social media, war. That is the expression is perfect storm, but I guess an imperfect storm, a bad storm.
Let's talk a little bit about U.S. elections. How much...
Now the easy question.
Yeah. How much does Israel matter? Would Israel be an issue come November 2024? If so, to what extent? Yeah. We think we are the center of the world. So,
again, let's play historian because it's so much easier. Israel has not decided U.S. elections. There's very few voters in the United States who are single-issue voters, and there's even fewer who are single-issue voters about Israel, Gaza, Palestine, etc. We're in a very, very competitive election in the United States. I think if we would have been having this conversation 7 or 8 months ago, all the, how do you say pundits, all the pashanim, right, in the United States would have said, yeah, well, you know, it's Biden's going to win. Might be a little bit competitive, but Biden's going to win. And then lots of evidence that it's going to be a very, very, very close race. And then you'll have some Democrats going, oh, don't worry, don't be a bedwetter, don't worry too much, and others saying, well, it's serious. I think it's a race, and it's gonna come down to a few number of states. So single issues don't move millions of voters nationally, probably don't even move hundreds of thousands of voters, but in a presidential election that could be decided by 5,000 votes in Michigan, 10,000 votes in Wisconsin.
Where you come from.
Where I used to come from, exactly. So listen, Wisconsin's a great example. Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 15,000 votes in 2016 and then lost it by 15,000 votes in 2020. I mean, incredibly small
Mm-hmm.
margins. Less than a mandate, half of a mandate.
Same went for Virginia.
Virginia, the Democrat won comfortably, but very close race in Georgia. Yeah, Georgia was a very close race, and Arizona was a very close race. So you had 3 states that were decided by half a percentage point. So a combination of people not voting. Or voting because I don't see lots of people in Michigan who are angry with Biden about Israel coming out and voting for Donald Trump. I don't see a lot of that. What's also interesting though is in some parts there's a large Arab American community in Michigan who is certainly concerned and energized about what's going on. But they're also very religiously conservative as well. So some of those areas were actually moving a little bit more Republican, not based on stuff going on in this neighborhood, but based on issues of religious conservatism in the United States. That's a little bit of an aside. But typically I would say a single issue isn't going to decide it. That single issue isn't going to be Israel. but we are in a phenomenally competitive environment where this presidential election could be decided by 10, 15, 20,000 votes, even less in a couple states. I think it would be more on turnout being affected than by people voting for a different side.
Turnout is the name of the game.
Yeah, no, turnout is the name of the game. It's important, but turnout is -1. Persuasion is -2, right? Because someone doesn't vote, you get one less. But if they go to the other side, it's double. Now, there's also a school of thought that give you some boring political science here, right? You get these big debates. Is it turnout or is it performance? And my answer is always yes. Okay, because it is. Because it's both. There is an argument that some people will make now that, and I think I'm one of those people who would make it, that turnout in presidential elections in the United States has been very high. We're just
60 something.
Yeah, which is going to sound low to Israelis, but that's high in recent history in the United States.
Unfortunately, not that low for the last 7-8 years.
Interesting. Okay.
We went up last time back to 70, but we were
below that.
Below that, about 63, 64.
Interesting. Yeah. So we reached this, very high turnout. I'm not sure there's much more to be gained in increasing turnout. There's a lot of people on the Democratic side who are consultants who will argue people are so energized is the wrong word because it's not energizing, but ginned up about politics now and elections that in a presidential election year there's not a lot you can do to move turnout. But again, I'm going to give you the wimpy caveat. When we're talking about 3 or 4 states deciding the presidency by a very narrow margin, as a political scientist, I could go, oh, that's a very, very small effect. But if that very small effect gets you from 49.9 to 50.1, then it's decisive.
You mentioned it earlier, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about it. Why is it so difficult to poll young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you certainly saw some recent polls that got a lot of attention here. So polling in general is difficult, as we all saw from President Hillary Clinton in 2016, right?
Yeah.
And even in 2020, Biden obviously won, but the race was much closer than the polls were predicting. And so there's different methodologies of polling, right? The old world of polling by phone, by landline, that world has gone, right? Survey on cell phones, talking to people. There's online surveys. There's different methods of sampling. I do a lot of survey work. There is no silver bullet, right? I think you have to use multiple methodologies, and certain methodologies are going to get different sorts of people. So you will see variance in young people by what the methodology is of the study. It's also the case in the United States, although it's much more the case here. I'll say this has always bothered me about Israel. The level of so anyone who's an editor of an Israeli newspaper or television station, you never, ever, ever, ever release any details on the surveys. It's ridiculous. It's bad. Stop doing that. Anyways, that's my short advertisement. But also in the United States, sometimes you don't have detailed methodological understanding of what happened. It's very hard to get young people to do surveys. So are the young people you're getting, what sort of young people are they? Are they very connected, very interested in politics, or what's going on? And then the other, and this is a little bit technical, surveys are weighted for a general population. So surveys here, right? You do a population of Israel and you know some things about the demographics and you didn't get enough people from the north or enough people from the south or enough people who are religious or enough people who are not religious, whatever the case is. And you know what those percentages of the population should be. So you push them up or you push them down. We do the same in the United States. I know the number of white people. I know the number of people of certain ages. I know the number of people who have a college education. I know the number of people who don't have a college education. So I can weight the numbers. But when I do that, I'm doing that for the study as a whole. And then someone comes and says, hey, you just did a study of 2,000 people. That's a lot.
Nice.
That's a large study. I bet most of the surveys here are like 500. Okay.
Yes, not ours, but yes.
Okay, good. Not yours. Yours are good. Yours are transparent. But typical study in the United States, like this New York Times study last week, was 1,000 people. Okay, designed to say something about the U.S. population as a whole, and then suddenly you pull out 130 young people,
Okay.
and it might actually not even be 130 young people because they might have weighted up that number. And then, sorry to be such a chnun, the other thing that's going on is the composition of those young people might not be what the actual composition of that young people is by education, by race, by ethnicity. So small sample size, so they're very noisy, weighted for overall, and what we really need is studies that are designed to be representative of particular young groups.
For the specific segment of
Yeah.
the population.
וזה למה אני לא עושה זה בעברית, כי אין לי מושג איך להסביר זה בעברית. So, sorry to your listeners.
Okay, now they understand. So, university campuses, you don't think it's real what is going on there?
No, I don't want to say I don't think what's real. I think
are university campuses biased?
Listen, university campuses are not on fire, right? I think I talk with university leaders a lot. I visit university campuses a lot, and I think there's this notion if you were sitting here in Israel watching the TV that every single U.S. campus is walking through huge demonstrations all the time.
And according to the New York Times, it is.
So there was a New York Times article today, I think, which greatly exaggerated what's going on. You have smaller groups of very energized people on campus. I think some campuses are hotter than others. It's not a question I can answer how individual students are feeling about their own safety and security. But I don't want to be too glib or too sarcastic, but I spent a lot of time the last couple months on college campuses, and your regular student on a U.S. college campus still cares about grades, job, what they're going to do tonight, and most importantly, is their offense going to be able to score on Saturday? So even during a very difficult fall, the campuses I work with functioned. I visited many, and you wouldn't even realize anything was going on most of the time when I visited them. That said, if you were a college president, if you were a college chancellor, if you were in communications at these universities, you were spending a lot of time on it. I also think it's a case where lots of times young people will have very similar views on political matters. And so college campuses aren't going to get much of a disagreement because let's take abortion, for example. I think, not looking at the data, but I would imagine, especially at the campuses I work, the overwhelming majority of students are pro-choice.
Yeah.
Overwhelming. So you're just not going to have fights because there's no disagreement. One of the reasons why you're having fights is a dramatic word here is you have people who think differently. And I think universities are going to continue to need to do better to teach their students how to have those discussions and arguments when there is such deep-seated disagreement.
How to disagree.
Yep.
Professor Gולדסטין, you are one of America's leading experts on political campaigns and the use and impact of advertising. What are we doing wrong?
So it's a substantive question, and it's a marketing question. I don't live here. I don't vote here. I didn't serve in the army. My kids don't live here. So I'm always very, very careful about giving substantive advice about what you should do here. What I will say objectively is some of the policies and some of the faces of the current Israeli government aren't doing you favors in the United States. So that's substantively. Now, do you got a marketing problem? Yes. And I think one key part of that is we want to be lawyers. We want to be litigators, right? So, there's this thinking, oh, there's a kid on campus with a Palestinian flag. If I just explain to them about the Balfour Declaration and the Peel Commission and the 1936 deal, then they would understand it and it would be fine. That is Greeks and Romans to those kids. I think there is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of this country and the diversity of this country. And although both of us as nerds, as scholars, as observers, as of analysts, want to go to logic and debate, the human brain is wired for feelings, and those who are trying to tell Israel's story are going to have to figure that out.
Professor Gולדסטין, although we are well over our time, I cannot finish this conversation without asking you, what would you like our audience to take with them from our discussion?
I get interviewed a lot. That's a great question. During my time here the last week, it's been amazing to connect with friends. And this conversation we had on the podcast, listen, every meal in Israel is a podcast, right? And
yeah.
So I've had good practice for your questions because I've been answering them from every breakfast, lunch, and dinner with my friends from the last week. I think it's very important that Israelis understand I am not discounting the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism and the anti-Israel activity that's happening, some in the United States and certainly more in Europe and other countries. Anti-Semitism isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? Okay? Just because everybody hates you unfairly doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. So let's have our eyes wide open, and I don't think I'm naive, but let's be smart.
Thank you very much, Professor Gולדסטין, Senior Vice President for Survey Research and Institutional Policy at the Association of American Universities, for taking the time to talk to us today. I would like to thank all האוניברסיטה Reychman University's Audio Center. Thank you all for being with us. You can find us on all possible apps, Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and on the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility's website. Take care and be good to one another.